economic force. Because Canada and the United States, that would really be something.
So I think Canada is going to be a very serious contender to be our 51st state.
When the world's largest economies start playing games on the edge, everyone feels the consequences. This was the case when the US decided to flex its muscles and declared a trade war on its closest ally, Canada. At first glance, it seemed like a flawless political move. Washington imposed 25% tariffs on Canadian truck and auto parts imports, confident that its northern neighbor would quickly make concessions. But what happened next came as a real shock to the White House.
Specifically, under the new U.S. approach, countries must now buy access to the world's largest economy through a combination of tariffs, investments, unilateral trade liberalization, and policy changes in their home markets.
This story is not just about numbers and tariffs. It is a story about how one country was able to turn humiliating pressure into a push for independence and economic growth. It is about how strategy, cool-headedness, and calculation proved stronger than loud slogans and economic blackmail. While Washington insisted that the new trade policy would strengthen the domestic market, something else was happening behind the scenes. Contrary to all predictions, the Canadian economy began to gain momentum. Canada didn't just weather the storm, it changed the rules of the game. Instead of complaining about unfairness, the government in Ottawa responded with action. Programs were launched to support domestic manufacturers, tax breaks were provided to technology companies, and huge investments were made in the future in the production of batteries and electric vehicles. These steps not only compensated for the losses, they laid the foundation for a new industrial boom.
Really build on that relationship, and I think that's why the outcome this week was a positive one. Well, we know that no deal has been struck. We know that negotiations are going ahead in the right direction.
Meanwhile, unexpected side effects began to emerge in the United States. The tariffs that were supposed to save American factories ended up hurting them. Companies faced rising costs, and domestic car prices began to skyrocket. Consumers were outraged, analysts sounded the alarm, and manufacturing giants couldn't understand why their own protective measures had backfired. At that moment, Canada took another step that no one expected. It began to conclude new trade agreements with Asia, Europe, and Latin American countries. Markets that had not even been discussed before opened up to Canadian exports. The economy that Washington had tried to make dependent became an example of flexibility and foresight.
As in previous trade disputes, Canada has implemented a series of retaliatory tariffs. Their objectives have been to protect Canadian workers and businesses and to incentivize a negotiated settlement with the United States. Few other countries followed suit.
The trade war, conceived as a tool of pressure, turned into a defeat for those who started it, and humiliation for those who hoped to dictate terms. It turned out that in the 21st century, power is not just about factories and tariffs. Power lies in the ability to adapt, to seek new paths, in diplomacy and technological development. Today, Canada is demonstrating just that. It has not only recovered from the blow, it has become stronger. Its industry is reaching new heights, and its energy independence and resilience to crises make it one of the key players on the world stage.
As a result of these developments, the breadth and the depth of the changes in U.S. trade policy have become more fully apparent.
This story is a reminder to all who believe that economic pressure always leads to victory. Sometimes it gives rise to something completely different, a new era of independence, strategic thinking, and quiet but confident victory. In this video, you will learn how Canada not only survived the trade war, but turned it into its own victory, and why this example can be a lesson for the whole world. When the White House finally formalized the idea of America First, no one yet understood how far it would go. The new economic doctrine, which Donald Trump had been talking about since the early days of his presidency, promised to bring back jobs, revive American factories, and prove to the world that the US could dictate the terms of global trade. That was when the story began that would later be called one of the most resounding mistakes in American trade policy. The reason was a seemingly minor detail: 25% tariffs on imports of medium-duty and heavy-duty trucks from Canada. The decision, taken in the midst of tense negotiations with Beijing and Brussels, was intended to be a symbol of toughness, a signal to allies that America would no longer play the role of a good-natured partner.
In a positive and very important development earlier this month, just a few weeks ago, the United States reaffirmed a core commitment to our free trade agreement, CUSMA, by reinforcing that those Canadian exports to the United States that are compliant with that agreement, that are compliant with CUSMA, will not be subject to U.S. IEEPA tariffs.
Washington expected Ottawa to quickly back down. Canada's economy, closely linked to that of the US, was indeed dependent on the American market. More than 70% of Canadian exports went south, and the automotive industry was considered one of the most vulnerable. At that time, Canadian factories produced over 1 million cars a year, and almost every second one was destined for American consumers. It seemed that a blow to this sector would be fatal, but the miscalculation turned out to be colossal. Just a few weeks after the decree was signed, alarming headlines began to appear in the American media. Auto parts manufacturers in Ohio, Michigan, and Indiana reported the first supply disruptions. Companies dependent on Canadian components faced rising prices, and some faced the threat of conveyor belt stoppages. The problem was that the North American automotive industry was not just a trade partnership, it was a single ecosystem built up over decades. Engine parts were manufactured in Windsor, electronics in Detroit, and assembly took place on both sides of the border. Breaking these ties with tariffs was as impossible as cutting a nerve and hoping that the body would continue to move.
In fact, the average U.S. tariff rate on the world has jumped from just over 2% at the end of last year to almost 16%, 8 times higher. 16% currently.
Meanwhile, the Canadian government responded not with haste, but with cold calculation. The first meetings were held behind closed doors, without any loud statements. Where the American side acted through press releases and emotional speeches, Ottawa chose silence. When journalists demanded comments, officials limited themselves to short phrases about seeking a balanced response. In reality, one of the most accurate and balanced economic counterattack plans in recent years was being developed at that moment. The main goal was not to respond in kind to Washington, but to strengthen the domestic economy. The first step was to review strategic industries, from the automotive industry to metallurgy. Canadian analysts suggested using the crisis as a catalyst to accelerate technological modernization. A temporary fund was created to support businesses that could suffer from US tariffs. But the main feature was not so much the financing as the system of tax incentives. The government effectively exempted companies investing in the development of production facilities in the country from income tax.
And to these ends, the United States has announced a series of trade actions. Those began near the start of this year with the so-called IEEPA tariffs against Canada and Mexico based on U.S. concerns about the border and fentanyl trafficking.
Against this backdrop of calm, the US reaction appeared increasingly chaotic. Donald Trump spoke at press conferences about victory over unfair trade practices, but even within his administration, doubts were being voiced. Advisors warned that measures against Canada could hurt the domestic market, as Canadian companies supplied a significant portion of the components for American auto giants. However, the momentum of political PR proved stronger than logic. The first economic consequences were not long in coming. Within 2 months, analysts at J.P. Morgan and Bloomberg published reports noting an average increase in the cost of American cars of 6 to 8%. According to the American Automobile Manufacturers Association, about 40% of the auto components subject to the new tariffs were produced in joint ventures where the capital belonged to both countries. In other words, the US imposed tariffs on itself. Against this backdrop, Canada experienced what would later be called the countertrade effect. While Washington was pushing sanctions, Ottawa began to conclude cooperation agreements with South Korea, Norway, and Indonesia. These deals seemed insignificant, but each of them opened up new supplies of technology and resources. An agreement with one of the Asian countries on the joint production of lithium batteries became particularly important, a step that later determined the direction of the entire North American energy industry.
Well, when U.S. officials talk, we need to make sure that we listen.
I spoke to Governor Trudeau on numerous occasions, and we'll see what happens. But it just sets up so good for them. Look, the people would pay much less tax than they're paying right now. They'd have perfect military protection.
However, the most unexpected reaction came from within Canada itself. Whereas previously businesses had complained about excessive dependence on American investment, now a wave of economic patriotism swept through society. Slogans such as "Build it for ourselves" and "Canada is the manufacturing of the future" appeared. Ordinary citizens began to actively support domestic manufacturers, and large corporations began to invest in their own facilities. According to the Ministry of Industry, domestic investment grew by almost 12% in the first 6 months after the tariffs were introduced. This was a record high for the decade. Meanwhile, the American side was increasingly losing control of the situation. Trump demanded reports, advisors argued, and car companies warned of mass layoffs. Some media outlets even wrote that the possibility of temporarily easing tariffs in the interests of national stability was being discussed behind the scenes at the White House, but no one dared to publicly admit the mistake. In Canada, there was a growing sense that the country had passed the test. Economists compared this moment to the financial reforms of the 1990s, when the economy underwent a painful but productive restructuring. Now, under pressure from across the ocean, Canada has effectively begun a second industrial renewal. New electric motor factories, software development centers for smart transportation systems, and research in hydrogen technology all became symbols of how a crisis can become a springboard.
Those were quickly followed by reciprocal tariffs on every U.S. trade partner and very high sectoral tariffs applied globally on strategic industries, including steel, aluminum, autos, and copper.
At the same time, the diplomatic component was strengthened. Canadian representatives in the WTO began to actively promote unfair and fair interdependence, calling on countries to consider the consequences of unilateral tariffs for the global economy. This idea quickly gained support in Europe, where dissatisfaction with US protectionism was also growing at the time. Washington, meanwhile, found that even its own allies were beginning to look for ways around the tariffs. Some American corporations moved part of their production to Canada to avoid the duties. As a result, within a year, the share of Canadian goods in the global auto parts market grew by almost 9%, while that of American goods declined. This was not just an economic indicator, it was a symbol of a shift in the center of gravity. By the end of the first year of the trade war, it became clear that instead of breaking the Canadian economy, the US had actually pushed it towards modernization. Ottawa strengthened its position, diversified its exports, and scored political points at home. Most importantly, it demonstrated to the world that strength does not always lie in striking, but often in the ability to withstand a blow and use its energy.
In a positive and very important development earlier this month, just a few weeks ago, the United States reaffirmed a core commitment to our free trade agreement, CUSMA, by reinforcing that those Canadian exports to the United States that are compliant with that agreement, that are compliant with CUSMA, will not be subject to U.S. IEEPA tariffs.
Thus ended the first act of this story. America confidently pulled the trigger, but the bullet ricocheted back at it. The second act began when Canada went from defense to offense. It was the moment when it transformed from an economic victim into a strategic player, ready to shape its own rules of global trade. And while Washington realized this too late, Ottawa concluded that dependence is not a sentence if you know how to turn weakness into an advantage. When the first signs of stabilization appeared in economic reports, Ottawa already understood that simply holding out was not enough. It was necessary to seize the moment. The response to pressure from Washington was to be not a temporary measure, but the foundation for a new model of development. This marked the beginning of a phase that analysts would later call the Canadian Leap. The government decided that the country could no longer afford to live in the shadow of the US, supplying raw materials and components. Canada had to become a full-fledged player, capable of dictating trends rather than adapting to them. The first steps in this direction were pragmatic. After the introduction of tariffs, the country still had a lot of capacity focused on exports to the US. It was not possible to simply close them down, so instead they began to be re-equipped. Work began on former car assembly lines in Ontario to produce batteries for electric vehicles and components for wind turbines. During this period, the government launched a series of business support programs in coordination with major banks. Companies that invested in green technologies received preferential zero-interest loans for the first 3 years. At the same time, the Zero Emission North program was implemented to reduce the carbon footprint of industry. In essence, the crisis became a catalyst for Canada's accelerated transition to a green economy.
The United States has also imposed substantial trade actions on the Canadian lumber industry. Now, in recent weeks, the United States has agreed a series of trade deals with a variety of countries. And these deals have several aspects in common. First, baseline tariffs that cover a broad range of goods and services that are substantially higher than those U.S. tariffs that existed before.
But domestic production was only half of the strategy. The other half was foreign policy quiet, persistent, and well thought out. While Washington continued to show toughness and build tariff barriers, Canadian diplomats began to consistently strengthen international ties. One of the first areas of focus was the Asia-Pacific region. Ottawa realized that Asia was the future center of global demand. Just 6 months after the start of the trade crisis, Canada opened a trade office in Jakarta and stepped up negotiations with Singapore and South Korea. Formally, these steps were explained as diversification, but in fact they were part of a strategic reformatting of the entire foreign trade. The story of the new agreement on agricultural exports to Southeast Asia was particularly telling. As American farmers lost part of their foreign markets due to trade restrictions, Canadian exporters began to fill this niche. According to the Ministry of Agriculture, grain and oilseed exports to countries in the region grew by almost 40% over the year. This not only compensated for the losses from the reduction in trade with the US, but also made Canada one of the key players in the Asian food sector.
This new U.S. trade policy has several motivations: to raise tariff revenues, to protect strategic industries, to encourage foreign investment in the United States, and to change trade and non-trade policy in U.S. partners.
Canadian diplomacy was no less active in Europe. At a time when the European Union itself was facing growing protectionism from the US, Ottawa was able to present itself as a reliable partner. New agreements were signed on the supply of aluminum and rare earth metals to European industry, as well as framework agreements on joint investments in renewable energy sources. In Brussels, Canadian initiatives were called an example of economic pragmatism, and the press wrote that Ottawa was turning the trade war into a school of diplomatic skill. Against the backdrop of these successes, the US began to feel the reverse pressure. American companies, especially those in the technology sector, expressed dissatisfaction with the fact that Canada was gaining new markets and investments, while American contracts were stalling due to tariff barriers. One analytical report published early the following year stated bluntly that the pressure policy had led to Canada surpassing the US in export growth to new regions for the first time in a decade.
Those trade deals with other countries also have limited or no relief from those sectoral tariffs in those strategic industries such as steel and autos. They include substantial commitments by the U.S. trade partners for investments in the United States and significant unilateral trade liberalization measures.
But profound changes were also taking place within Canada itself. A shift in focus to high technology and sustainable development changed the structure of the economy. Universities launched new research programs in materials science and battery systems, and a culture of long-term planning began to take shape in industry. Former automotive manufacturing centers were transformed into innovation clusters where engineers, environmentalists, and entrepreneurs collaborated. One government report noted that in the 3 years following the introduction of US tariffs, the share of Canadian companies that had implemented automation and digital technologies had nearly doubled. Politically, Ottawa seized the moment to strengthen its image as a responsible power. At international forums, Canadian representatives advocated for the creation of mechanisms to prevent economic pressure between allies. This initiative received unexpected support, even from some NATO members, which was an unpleasant signal for Washington. It seemed that for the first time in many years, Canada was able to speak to the US not as a junior partner, but as an equal player.
And Canada's been tough on the military because they have a very low military cost.
They don't allow our banks. Did you know that? Canada does not allow banks to go in.
Interestingly, changes were also taking place in the financial markets during this period. The Canadian dollar, which had weakened against the US dollar at the beginning of the crisis, gradually strengthened. Investors began to perceive Canada as a safe haven, a country with a stable economy, predictable politics, and growing exports. This led to an influx of capital, especially from Europe. According to the Bank of Canada, foreign direct investment increased by almost a third, with a significant portion going to green energy and electric transportation projects. While Canada was strengthening its position, the United States was increasingly mired in its own problems. Rising car and metal prices caused public discontent, and the White House's attempts to blame unfair partners for this sounded less and less convincing. Some American experts even openly acknowledged that Canada had managed to come out unscathed by using the crisis as a tool for modernization. Against this backdrop, a shift in consciousness took place in Canadian society. Whereas national identity had previously been based largely on the idea of being the quiet neighbor of the United States, there was now increasing talk of independence and leadership. Journalists wrote about a new North American balance in which Canada was not an appanage, but an independent center of power. Even public opinion polls showed that more than 70% of citizens supported the course of independent economic policy,